Open this day that we might receive all that you are giving us. In your name we pray. Amen. If there is one word in the English language that I would be happy to never hear again, it is unprecedented. Unprecedented, a word meaning never having before been seen or done. It has been used so many times these past few years in the news and in our conversations that it's, well, unprecedented. Just this past week, there were news stories about an unprecedented plan to ration water in Chile due to the 13-year drought that's taking place there. An unprecedented humanitarian crisis is burgeoning in Eastern Africa due to the confluence of climate change and fuel costs and food costs. We're all aware of the unprecedented cost of gasoline, yes? But did you know that there is also an unprecedented global helium shortage? This could quite possibly lead to an unprecedented reduction in the number of balloon bouquets at this year's graduations. Of course, not all things that are unprecedented are bad. This week there was also an unprecedented settlement that was reached between the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, and the U.S. Department of Justice, instituting strict limits on the use of police force in that city. There were also an unprecedented number of housing vouchers that were distributed to people experiencing homelessness in Orange County, California, to help take a step towards resolving the homelessness crisis there. Even still, I don't know about you, but I could really go for some precedented times. You know, if the world could just be a little less unremarkable, a little more ordinary and normal for a little bit. I don't think we need a new normal. Just an old normal would be fine. I wonder if that's how the first witnesses to the resurrection might have felt as well. Because there had been so much about that week leading up to Jesus' crucifixion that was remarkable and surprising and life-altering. It must have felt like the ground was constantly shifting underneath them, from the way that he strode into the temple courtyard and flipped over the money changers' tables, to the way that he tenderly got down and washed their feet at the Last Supper, from the way that the crowds had crushed in around to cheer him as he rode into the city, and then the way they turned on him, demanding that Pilate release instead Barabbas and crucified Jesus. Nothing about this last week had been normal. Truth be told, nothing about their lives had been normal since they met Jesus and left everything behind to follow him. But then he was killed, and everything changed again. Except that death they understood, right? They knew people who had lived long lives and had died peaceful deaths. It was common too for infants and children to die too young, because there were so many illnesses and so few cures in those days. They had probably even borne witness to a crucifixion or two, given the empire's penchant for using this cruel form of execution to keep the peace among their conquered territories. These followers of Jesus, they knew the cold, hard reality of loss. They had felt before the way in which their eyes were so raw and red from crying, the deep pain of knowing that they would never see their beloved friend again. And they had some idea of what you were supposed to do when someone died. They had rituals and practices, things that they could engage in to bring some measure of comfort and solace and sense in the wake of death. Some men took Jesus' lifeless body and placed it in a borrowed tomb. And the women went home and prepared spices so that when the Sabbath was over, they could give him a proper burial. This was how you dealt with death. It was not the normal they wanted, of course, but it was precedented. Until that morning when the women came to the tomb and they found that the stone that had been placed over the opening in the grave had been moved aside. And they looked in to see that Jesus' body was no longer there. This was perplexing, but perhaps there was a rational explanation. There were known to be grave robbers in Jerusalem. This tomb had belonged to a wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea. Maybe some thieves had thought that the person who died was buried with some valuables, not knowing that the body inside actually belonged to a homeless, penniless rabbi from Galilee. Well, that would explain the moving of the stone, but why would they take the body? And as the women are talking this over and trying to make some sense of it, some men in dazzling clothes appear. Now, an empty tomb is one thing, but holy messengers? That's really unexpected. And the women were terrified and they fell to their knees, not knowing who these men were or where they had come from, but that there was knowing that there was something truly otherworldly about them. And their question, why are you looking for the living among the dead? What a strange question, because after all, they weren't looking for the living among the dead. They were looking for the dead among the dead. That's how things are usually done, isn't it? So of course, immediately the women leave the cemetery and they go to find the disciples who are hiding out, afraid that the Roman authorities might be looking for them too. And they tell the disciples what they have seen about the stone rolled away and the empty tomb and the strangers in their sparkling clothes, and how these men or angels had reminded them of everything that Jesus had said would happen when he died. But the disciples don't believe them because their story makes no sense. This doesn't happen. Resurrection, that's unprecedented. And because it's new, it's also hard. It's hard to comprehend, it's hard to trust, it's hard to live into. Now, you have likely been told that the resurrection, it's about faith. That the whole point of us is to believe in something that is impossible, except with God. And so many times the church tells the Easter story as if these disciples of Jesus, they were a little taken aback at first, but then it all made sense. They thought about it, they remembered what Jesus had said, and then they understood without question that Jesus had risen from the dead just like he said he would. And because we tell the story this way, this cornerstone of our faith becomes sometimes one of those stumbling blocks that we've been talking about during Lent. Because either you believe in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead and you have faith, or you doubt and you question and you don't believe, and there's something wrong with you. But we should not forget that all of the resurrection accounts are full of people who didn't believe. No one who witnessed the resurrection that morning expected to find Jesus alive. The first ending of Mark's gospel has the women running away and telling no one because they're scared. And as John tells it, when Jesus comes face to face with Mary, she doesn't even recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener because that would make a lot more sense. And Luke's story is full of adjectives like perplexed, terrified, amazed. And yet when we tell the story now, we tend to leave out the parts about the shock and the disbelief and the fear that comes in the face of new life. Why is that? We all know that new life is hard. It flies in the face of all our expectations. It turns everything that is familiar upside down. New life comes at a cost. Old life we understand, but new life, well, that's a different story. New life is hard because we don't know how to prepare for it. It's something that we've never experienced before. Perhaps it's because Easter comes in this season when everything that was dormant during the winter appears to come back to life, and blood bloom and bud again, that we often talk about resurrection being like spring. But spring is a season that comes around every year. Sure, it might arrive a little earlier or a little later. It might be a little colder this year than last. There might be more pollen that we would like. Spring is renewal, but it's not really new. It's what we have come to expect, what we look forward to. We know how to prepare. We stock up on Claritin and Kleenex. We break out the sandals, but we keep the warm coats out just in case. This is what we did last year, and the year before, and the year before. But new life, that's something else. New life requires different skills, a new perspective. New life is about learning new habits and patterns and learning to trust in things that are unfamiliar and strange. The other day I was out for a run on a country road, and our route took us past a field of cows. And my running partner stopped suddenly because she'd been passing this field for weeks, keeping an eye on this very pregnant mother cow, waiting to see a baby be born. And that morning, there he was at last. Little brown calf with a white mask covering his face, and his coat was still wet with afterbirth and the spit of his mother. And we stood there just looking in awe as this little baby calf gingerly took his very first steps. He stretched out his spindly legs, and he was wobbly and off balance, and at first he could only take 1 or 2 steps before he dropped down to the ground in exhaustion. But then the mother cow would come up behind him and nudge him, encouraging him to get up, try again. I think the Easter faith of the disciples was a lot like that. They didn't believe what the women had seen. In fact, they called it an idle tale. The magical thinking of these exhausted and grief-stricken women. But Peter, at least, was curious enough to go and see the empty tomb for himself. In fact, the gospel tells us that he got up and he ran there. He was probably stumbling along the way, his exhausted legs feeling like lead, and he put one foot in front of the other until he got to the tomb where Jesus' body had been, and he could see it for himself. One by one in the resurrection stories, Jesus' friends come to their own realization that this new life has actually happened. But it didn't take place immediately or without some moments of stumbling or feeling weak in the knees. And because this invitation to new life is for us as well, it means it's okay for us to bring our wonder and our questions and our doubts. It's okay if we at first resist this invitation to new life because we are still mourning what we had. And as we step into new life, we're probably going to stumble. Because after all, we are bringing our old selves. Even in the face of resurrection, we are the same people that we have been, but we are living in a new reality. As Nadia Bolz-Weber puts it, resurrection is not reversal. We are living forward, not backward. And this is what she wrote on Easter last year, but I think it's just as relevant this year. As we return to life, we are carrying our own wounds from loss and isolation. Many of us are stepping into the first light of a post-pandemic dawn, and I'm not sure I can ever be who I was before. But I'm also not totally sure who everyone else is now either. We are emerging into new beauty and new wisdom. We are not who we were, but we get to discover who we are. Help us, God, not to foreclose on each other. Maybe just grant us a holy curiosity for a while. You see, holy curiosity goes a long way when we're stepping into something new. Or when we're trying to hold the old and the new together, when we're trying to figure out what to let go of and what to keep, how to walk a new path in a new way. And there may be some pain in this process, but it is pain in the direction of growth. Lenny Duncan is a Lutheran pastor and the author of the book Dear Church, a love letter from a black preacher to the whitest denomination in America. But his road to the ministry is far from typical. When he was 13, he ran away from an abusive home with addicted parents. And by the time he was 19, he too was selling drugs. He got involved in a relationship with a woman who became pregnant. But then Lenny got arrested and sent to jail, and he missed the birth of his daughter, Jenna. When he was released from jail, he went to another city to try to get his life back together, but instead ended up falling back into addiction. He was in and out of prison, and he didn't see his daughter for 13 years. Eventually, he got out and he got sober. He made amends to the people he had hurt along the way, including the mother of his daughter, Bree. Eventually, Lenny and Bree became good friends. They ended up falling back in love and getting married on April Fool's Day when Jenna was 16. But just because Lenny and Bree were able to make a new life together didn't mean that they immediately became a family. Things were still messy and hard. They sometimes fought, and old wounds took a long time to heal. But there was a significant turning point that came about a year and a half into their new life together. Lenny said that Jenna was doing something that she wasn't supposed to be doing, and he called her out on it. And he said, "Man, she let me have it." She said, "You ruined my life. You destroyed everything. I've never had a family. I've never felt loved. I've never felt like I had any worth. You stole everything from me." And she screamed this 3 inches from my face. And then I walked outside and I got on the phone with a friend and I wept tears of joy because we knew that she trusted me enough to let me have it, which meant she knew I wasn't leaving. This new space of vulnerability and trust, they were able to build a new life together. And you know, I think this is why those men in dazzling clothes say to the women after they tell them that Jesus has been raised from the dead, to remember. Remember what Jesus told you about how he said he was going to be betrayed and handed over to his enemies. And remember that he said he was going to die. But remember where you were when he told you that. Remember that the bread and wine from the table were still on the table from the Passover meal. Remember that your feet were still wet from where he had washed them. Remember how your hearts were full to bursting with all the love he had poured into you. Remember Jesus' promise. I will never leave you. Things will change and you will have loss, but I will be with you always. So whatever new life you are stepping into right now, I hope you know that wherever you are headed, God is already there, preparing the way for you and likely doing something totally unexpected. Whether your new life right now looks like living with cancer, or welcoming a new baby into your family, moving to a new state, or caring for an aging parent. Whether it is about anticipating an empty nest, you are living into a change that can be hard, that might be fraught with loss and heartache, but it is not death. It is life, new life. Because God, the God of resurrection, is always bringing life out of death. We might resist the new because new is hard. But in the new, we keep on living and growing and changing one step at a time. And this, my friends, this is what it means to have Easter faith. Thanks be to God.